Really nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and my name is Peggy.
And I'm Robin. We are from English Studies of the FH.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And we have some questions about your short stories and novels. I heard that novel is actually a test for the writer's writing skills. And after reading your short stories, I suddenly find that short stories is actually also a test for the writer's writing skills. And I love your short stories, especially word tables and interesting facts. And I'm going to ask him about short stories and novels. Which one do you think is more challenging or enjoyable?
This is a good question. I would say that a novel is a large political act. And by political, I mean, in politics, you must make compromises. And you have the novel, and the characters, there are many of them. They want what they want. They have their own desires and motivations. This character wants to go that way, and that character wants to go that way. And you use your plot and story to try to corral them into moments of revelation and intensity. But then the plot wants to careen that way. The arc wants to keep going. In a novel, there are all the voices you have to balance, and you have to compromise. The novel wants to do this. The character wants to do that. I want to do this. So I think there is no perfect novel. I think it's a form that cannot be perfect. But the short story, you can be a dictator. Robin, do you want to be a dictator one day?
Sure.
Okay.
I want to be to control something.
Yes. Peggy, would you like to be a dictator?
Of course. Just like in the lecture, ask you that they believe that writing a novel or even writing a thesis or essay is so hard.
Yes.
Because in your novel or short stories, you always seems that you draw a picture in our minds.
Right.
After reading your sentences, we can notice that the very details. I really wonder that how could you write the things so specific? Do you do a lot of researches or just because of your imagination?
Yes. Well, that's a great question. I would say with a short story, you can be a dictator. It's short enough. You can control every element. It's usually only about one character, and it's just the critical few moments of transformation in their lives, and then the story ends. The second the emotions are delivered in the story must end, no matter what the story wants or the shape wants. But in a novel, you have other obligations, and it must keep going. But you can facet every aspect to make a perfectly jeweled little work of art with a story. And so that has its own pleasures. But a novel, of course, can deliver, an entire world. I think of a short story as like a battery that stores emotion, And as a writer, I can charge that battery up and just deliver it to you. And they're very powerful, I think. And when a story ends, it's like it steps on the brakes, like the way you step on the brakes in a car and you go crashing forward. Like, even though the story's over, you move forward into life afterwards, filled with all that energy, the kinetics of a story. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say in terms of those details are what make me believe. And I will, like the jazz musician who has to say, do I like that melody? I will write for a while, and then I'll wonder is this hollow? These people feel real? Do I believe I'm in North Korea, or that I'm in this building, or that this character has cancer? And it is in the details where the authenticity lies. And it is like the correlative that forms in a story or the significance that those details take on.
Yes, we can see that from short stories.
Yeah.
And like I said before, I especially like your short stories,
yes.
especially interesting facts.
Yes.
And I found the story has been written from the viewpoint of the woman.
Yes.
And Virginia Woolf says a great mind must be androgynous, and I think it is also true of the writing. If you want to be a writer, you must write from sometimes both from male and female perspective.
Right.
And when I read this short story, if I don't know anything about Adam Johnson,
Yeah.
I probably have assumed that it is a short story written by a woman.
Right.
Tell us how you wrote this short story from a woman's perspective.
Right. Well, Virginia Woolf, that's a very wise observation she makes there. I think when people first start writing, they do write from their own experiences. We're experts on ourselves. We know ourselves better than anyone, perhaps. But the time comes when you must leave your own experience and write across the gender line. And these are difficult. Right across class. I mean, if you've had a certain working background, what is it like to be rich or to be truly poor? How do you embody that? Age. Imagine writing this story from the perspective of someone who's 80, who's lived a whole life, and has a different sort of wisdom. Then you leave your culture to write the experience of someone in another country who has a totally different background. And I would say that as a writer, you need to have the technical skills, meaning a sense of perspective, point of view, structure, tense, point of narration, like the skills, right? And the abilities to imagine to tackle whatever character comes to you. And that's one of the reasons to learn to write beyond your own experience, because someday you may have a beautiful character or a beautiful story that comes to you, and you have to live up to it. And if you haven't been leaving your sense of self and haven't been trying to learn new skills, you're going to fail, and it will hurt. But you won't fail, Peggy. Robin, neither will you. You're going to be great story dictators.
Thank you.
Yes, I can tell, because you care about stories. Because we're talking seriously about stories.
I've already read interesting stories
Yes.
and the questions we discussed before. I really, yes, compare with Robin and bad writers.
So I don't know.
I admit you're right. So I always focus on some details on how to write, how do you find the inspiration of writing, such as the Orphan Master Science,
Yes.
into the novel settings in the North Korea,
Yes.
which people, they're curious about that place.
Right.
So that's why today the audience, when you talk about your experience in North Korea, they were so curious.
Right.
But before you start write this novel, why you want to write North Korea? So
Yes.
why it is so fascinating to you?
Well, if I wanted to write about China, or I guess if I was curious about China, or Italy, or the Congo, I would go find works of art written by those people. And I always do that. I don't know about you. When I travel and I go to another country, I always get a novel written by someone about that place, because I feel like a novel gives me just a sense of the personalities and the milieu of that place. And I read a memoir of a person who had lived in North Korea. His name was Kang Chol-hwan, and his life was fascinating. It blew my mind, and I honestly thought a couple things. One, that I didn't know much about Korea, and I was embarrassed. America had fought a war in Korea, and I really did not know much about that war. I remember when I was a kid, America made a TV show about it, which was a comedy, and that's really all I knew. But I had students who were Korean and Korean American. I had colleagues who were Korean, and I realized I'm very ignorant about this place. And so I read one book about North Korea, and when I went to find another one, just a human story, I couldn't. And over the course of a year, just as a reader, I read, books about the history of the regime, books about the economics and the military and the political dimensions. But I was curious, what was it like to be a teacher there? Or how do you find your girlfriend or boyfriend? Or how do you find your job? What do you have for breakfast? I didn't know those things, and I couldn't find those stories. And it turns out that, what I was later to discover was that North Koreans aren't allowed to tell their stories, and they're not allowed to read the stories of others. And so there was this big absence, And but turned me from being like a reader about North Korea to a writer is maybe two things. I discovered that the stories I was looking for weren't in books, they were on the internet. And missionaries and aid workers were taking these stories of people who crossed the Yalu and Tumen rivers in southern China, and they were putting them on the internet. And I could read normal people being interviewed. And another thing that happened in about 2005 is there's a facility in South Korea called Hanawon, and it's where all North Koreans must go when they resettle in the South. And they were providing the narratives of North Koreans. And so I could start reading real stories. And, you know, when someone tells you a difficult story, it can take up residence in you. And I was finding myself late at night, like I had to teach the next morning. And my eyes were tired, but I was gripped by stories of famine and difficult choices and survivor's guilt and loss and real human stories. And the second thing that happened is that I discovered propaganda, and that the North Koreans were telling their own national narrative, translating it into English in the newspapers, the Rodong Shinmun and the KCNA.net. And the works of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung were downloadable for free in English. And I could read those stories, the stories they told about themselves. And that really made me question narrative. And I was feeling like I was filled with like human portraits that weren't being shared anywhere. Like, you had to really go hunt for them. But like I said earlier, they weren't on my TV, right? They weren't in my newspaper, these stories. And so I wondered, like, could I fill that space? And I'm like a white guy who lives in California. And I'm not Korean, and I don't speak Korean, and I've never starved. I don't look like a starving person. So it was like going to have to make a really big leap, and I started just a little bit. I wondered if I couldn't do a little bit, and then it grew.
Yes, so you have written so much about North Korea. Have you, as a Westerner or as an outsider of North Korea, have you consciously or unconsciously presented American readers with a North Korea what they want to see, that they want to see?
Right.
Did you, in some sense, intensify their stereotypes of North Korea?
Right. Well, I don't know what the coverage of North Korea is here. I'll say that the coverage that I was exposed to was very minimal. And for instance, there was a movie in America called Team America World Police, in which Kim Jong-il was a funny puppet, right? And, portraits like this. And what I saw in the depictions of North Koreans in America were that this was a place of evil, a place of insanity, and a place of like clownishness, right? Like buffoonery. It's true, Kim Jong-il had his elevator shoes and his poofy hair and his glasses that made him look like a Pekingese cat. I mean, there's humor there, but that's all I found. And then the news was just like provocation, bellicose language. And it just wasn't, it's so hard to get enough context to make a human portrait. No one was doing it, at least not in news segments. And there's another thing that goes on, like, no one would ever make a joke about the Rwandan genocide, right? No one would ever make a joke about the tsunami in Japan or the earthquake in Haiti, because you're going to meet someone from those places. You're going to have to answer for that joke. But weirdly, you can make fun of North Korea because it's a free pass. They'll probably never hear the joke, and you'll never hear back. And I think that gives people permission to kind of make silly jokes, I guess, or to not make responsible portraits. And I mean, I did a lot of research, and I feel good about the portrait I made based on my research, but we won't know what it's like to be born and raised in North Korea until North Koreans are free to write, serious portraits themselves. And some defectors have started doing that.
So he mentioned that about this novel's character, just like you just told us, the intro stories, you can just control them. But in novel, maybe in your mind, you need to yourself need to fight with this character's nature. So when you read this novel because it's a long novel. We write maybe, for example, half of the novels. Do you think maybe yourself has already controlled this character? You put your own nature, your own experience, your own character into him.
Yes, I follow the character, and yes, it means fighting with yourself, and with all that you know. An interesting thing is that the North Korean posture is that America is the big enemy and aggressor, right? And one of the ways and there was a war, right? And so there is history. But the regime today says, oh, the reason we don't have food is because of American embargoes. The reason we don't have this is because of UN sanctions. And so they've set up this big enemy, and today they're criticizing America. It's like David and Goliath, right? And so to get the North Korean perspective right is to get an anti-American perspective. And, you know, it means criticizing my own country. And I think I think America's a great country, but it has a lot of flaws that should be addressed too. And when you read North Korean newspapers, whenever something bad happens in America, it's in the North Korean news, right? And true pop propaganda is actually factual, just one-sided in its definition. And so the things that North Korea puts in its newspapers, and I read the KCNA.net every morning for 8 years before I read my own newspapers, were true. And they would have stories about hunger in America, and homelessness, and prison populations. And they were right. You know, of course, they didn't mention the good things, and they didn't mention the bad things about their country. But to get the perspective right is to also take a hard look at America. There's a point of the book in which the North Koreans go to America, but I'm from their perspective. And to them, they see America as a strange and alien place filled with bizarre practices and contradictions. And actually, it was true in that narrow window of their perspective. And to come to my own country through the book and see my own land as alien and worthy of critique was something that would never have happened to me had I not tried to make that portrait.
Yeah. And besides North Korea, I found that we actually include some Japanese or Chinese or Native American elements in your short story. So why are you so interested in non-white American world?
I don't know, I would say I would write about a lot of topics. I do like to go to new places and explore new things in my writing. You know, it's interesting. To me, it seems like the country that's most obsessed with North Korea on earth is Japan. Of course, they have a troubled colonial history together. I don't think Japan has come to face some of the atrocities committed in the Korean Peninsula historically. But of course, North Korea had a campaign of kidnapping Japanese citizens. And actually, in Japanese, there's a verb that means to be kidnapped to North Korea. And it's the only language in the world with that verb. And yet, it's interesting that, like, I don't know, a large novel about North Korea wasn't written by a Japanese writer. Does that make sense? And, well, I mean, I don't know how I came to write this book. On one hand, like, every day I was like, who are you to write about someone else's culture? And that question is still there. I don't know why or how I did this book. But also there's, like, over time, like, another question came up, which was this: why aren't more writers trying to give voice and to bring to life, like, the most absent, voiceless people on earth? And, like, a question I had was like, how come a South Korean didn't write this book? Now, I only know about the books that have been translated in English, so I'll be honest there. And there have been, a couple books that are kind of about North Korea, but, genre-ish a bit. But a large, serious literary portrait about these people, I would think, would come from South Korea. So the answer to your question is, sometimes I think Well, I was at a big disadvantage at being an outsider. I think I maybe could see things that maybe
The insider can't see.
the insider can't see. Maybe.
Okay, Peggy, Robin, great pleasure.
Thank you.